Welcome back to Silicon Bites. They will make a nursery rhyme perhaps about this in future years. The Crimean Bridge is falling down. Well, it hasn't completely fallen down yet, but Ukraine has made another audacious move to help bring this war to an end and help bring Russia's defeat closer. Well, we'll come to that extraordinary strike on the Kerch Bridge in a minute, but there's also been significant development in the so-called peace process, the so-called talks happening in Istanbul, or rather the mask has slipped, and Russia's true purpose in engaging in the Istanbul process has been made abundantly clear by the vodka-soaked political thug Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's former one-term president. Russia has a talent for undermining its own cause and position, just as Ukraine's daring attacks may have led it to being blamed by the US administration for sabotaging the so-called peace talks. Russia ruins what could have been an effective political propaganda campaign. Former President and Prime Minister of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, says the quiet part out loud, that Russia seeks victory, not compromise in the talks with Ukraine. Medvedev, known for his incendiary and fascistic genocidal outbursts on Twitter, said on Tuesday that the point of holding talks with Ukraine was to ensure a swift and complete Russian victory, not anything to do with peace. The Istanbul talks are not for striking a compromise peace on someone else's delusional terms, but for ensuring our swift victory and the complete destruction of the neo-Nazi regime, Medvedev, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, said on Telegram. That's what the Russian memorandum published yesterday is all about, he said. By this, he means the Russian demands presented to Ukraine at talks in Istanbul on Monday. These in no way constitute peace proposals, but rather demands for Ukraine's capitulation. However, Moscow is in no position to enforce these stipulations, and there is no reason Ukraine would or should acquiesce to them. Sometimes I am at a loss to explain why Russia insists on repeating this garbage that is so far from any reasonable position that even the US think their proposals are farcical. The demands include handing over more territory, territory which Russia doesn't control, territory which Russia cannot take militarily unless it sacrifices tens, if not hundreds and hundreds of thousands of additional lives and equipment which it does not actually have. It insists on Ukraine becoming a neutral country, accepting limits on the size of the Ukrainian army, and holding new parliamentary and presidential elections, which of course is rich coming from a dictatorship like Russia, which has no right to actually dictate what any other countries do in their democratic systems. In other words, the military, political, and economic emasculation of Ukraine is what Moscow is demanding. The talks lasted only an hour, and the only agreement that could be reached, perhaps even discussed, was a new prisoner of war swap and an exchange of 12,000 dead soldiers. It must be noted that Moscow's demands were positioned as a precursor to a ceasefire only, not even the precursor to any kind of peace deal. Likely they were intended to be unpalatable, impossible even for Ukraine to accept and its Western partners and the US. Medvedev stated that the Istanbul negotiations are not intended to bring about a compromise peace based on what he called imaginary, unrealistic conditions. Medvedev added in a characteristically thuggish way that Moscow would take revenge. Retribution is inevitable, he said. Our army is pushing forward and will continue to advance. Everything that needs to be blown up will be blown up, and those who must be eliminated will be. So, if the true purpose of these so-called peace talks with Ukraine in Istanbul was to stall and prevaricate, as I have been suggesting all along on this channel, and Russia's true and unchanging position is to ensure its swift and complete victory over Ukraine, which of course it cannot achieve, then where did this leave even the concept of peace talks, even fake ones? The meeting between Ukrainian and Russian delegations on June 2nd lasted just over an hour, and was the second such meeting. The Russian delegation appeared to be glum and dejected for some reason, in sharp contrast to the previous meeting where they seemed arrogant and triumphalist. The sides agreed on further exchanges of specific categories of military personnel. Ukraine also submitted a list of several hundred children abducted by Russia. Well, more on that in a second. The Russian delegation proposed a temporary ceasefire limited to certain sections of the front. What use this may be to Ukraine is highly dubious. What use would it be if the war was frozen on fronts where Russia is making little progress and escalated in areas where they are pushing through? That would be an absurd set of proposals, but this is likely Moscow's strategy. Well, now on to the news of the day, which will likely make any immediate resumption of the fake peace process even less likely. In another audacious move, Ukraine hit the Kerch Bridge, linking Crimea to Russia with underwater explosives. The operation apparently severely damaged the base of the Crimean Bridge, opened by Putin in 2018. Kiev's SBU security service announced today. Ukraine detonated a massive underwater blast targeting the key road and rail bridge connecting the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula to Russia, damaging its underwater supports. This bridge is not just a symbol of Russian pride, but of the personal power and authority of dictator Vladimir Putin. This is the second high-profile operation by Ukraine's SBU security service in days, striking significant Russian assets after a sophisticated drone raid on Moscow's strategic bomber fleet on Sunday, which, of course, we ran an extended Silicon Bytes episode on. The latest strike on the 12-mile-long Kerch Bridge appears to be part of a determined effort by Ukraine to change the narratives promoted by the Trump administration that Kiev holds few cards in the war, and it's working. The stories of the attack on strategic Russian airfields and the bridge have been covered by conservative news outlets, very much aided by a friend of this channel, Joseph Lindsley. The coverage is not of the usual negative kind, but instead is starting to marvel at the strength, the bravery, innovation, and imagination, and the sheer chutzpah of the Ukrainians in striking such a historically unprecedented blow against the larger invader. Again, on this channel, we've been suggesting for some time now that the way to beat Russia is through strength and boldness and decisiveness, and in many ways being unpredictable to the enemy. The very opposite of Western strategy over the last 3 years, over the last 11 plus years, in fact, and the very opposite of what is embodied by escalation management. We've also said on many occasions that the way to turn the tide of disinformation narratives that have penetrated the American right wing, including the podcast world and media bubble, is not to appeal to moral values or exude weakness or emphasize the victim status of Ukraine, but to change the narrative and portray Ukraine as winners and Russians as losers. Destroying the myth of invincible Russia is the number one strategy to turn this around and get the US back on side. And Ukraine's operations this week are a big step in that direction. Of course, the Russians are losing their minds over the attacks. One Z patriot bemoans the idea that, quotes, the Hochels will probably now win the war. Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov raged on air over conscripts filming the attacks on the airfields. Can he shoot this conscript? He asks. Bring this bastard out and simply shoot him in front of the ranks as a traitor to the motherland. But our laws don't allow it. We are humanists. No, Vladimir, you are not a humanist. Your army are not humanists. And another genocidal monster, this time Russian negotiator Medinsky, whom Putin sent to the talks in Istanbul, reportedly dismissed Ukraine's demand to return the deported children, saying, "Don't put on a show for bleeding heart European old ladies with no children of their own." This was reported by journalist Oliver Carroll, and I hardly need to emphasize what a despicable, disgusting, and vile comment this is. But then Medinsky is a despicable, disgusting, and vile human being. The attack on the Crimean Bridge came as Ukraine confirmed it had been invited to the NATO summit later this month. It is an important step that otherwise would have gifted Putin a propaganda victory. The mining of the bridge, which is heavily defended by Russian forces, follows the audacious long-range drone attack on air bases deep inside Russia and the sabotage of two railway bridges in Russia over the weekend. Now, it's not yet clear if Ukraine was behind those attacks. 7 people were killed and 113 injured, including children, when 2 trains crashed because of the attacks. Now, that was likely not part of the plan or its objectives if indeed Ukraine was behind those attacks. Ukraine does not have a history in this war of targeting civilian objects as strategic targets, unlike Russia, of course. The SBU said the operation against the Kerch Bridge had been planned for several months and involved the equivalent of more than a metric ton of TNT, which it said had severely damaged the base of the bridge supports. It is the third time Ukraine has targeted the key logistics route since February 2022. In October 2022, a truck exploded on the bridge, while in July 2023, the SBU said it had blown up part of the bridge using an experimental naval drone. Both times, Russia repaired the damaged sections. Lieutenant General Vasyl Malyuk of the SBU, who supervised the latest operation, described the bridge as an absolutely legitimate target, especially considering that the enemy used it as a logistical artery to support its troops. Crimea is Ukraine, he said, and any manifestations of occupation will receive our tough response. The SBU published footage showing a blast coming out of the water and debris flying into the air. Road traffic on the bridge has been temporarily suspended, Russian authorities said on Telegram. Russian state media also reported it had been closed to traffic for many hours already. Russia also said on Tuesday that it was wrong to expect a quick breakthrough in Ukraine talks, a day after Moscow rejected Kiev's call for an unconditional ceasefire at the negotiations in Istanbul. The settlement issue is extremely complex and involves a large number of nuances. The Kremlin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters on Tuesday it would be wrong to expect immediate solutions and breakthroughs. Well, of course, Dmitry. The main complication is that Russia has parked its army in a different country and refuses to leave. It's pretty simple. When the Russian army goes, the war ends and there will be peace and freedom. Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, arrived in the US along with Deputy Prime Minister Yuly Serdenko to press for tougher sanctions on Russia. We plan to talk about defense support and the situation on the battlefield, strengthening sanctions against Russia, Yermak said on Telegram. Ukraine has a response to Russian aggression, though. God loves the Trinity, and the SBU always brings what is conceived to the end and never repeats itself, SBU Chief Vasyl Malyuk said in a statement posted on social media. Is he also in that Trinity, referring to the sabotage of bridges, or is there another act that is about to unfold? Well, only the coming days will tell. The underwater supports of the Crimea Bridge's piers were severely damaged as the 1,100 kilograms of explosives in TNT equivalent were detonated, according to the statement. Previously, we struck the Crimea Bridge in 2022 and 2023. So today we continued this tradition underwater, he added. And today, without inflicting any civilian casualties, the first explosive was activated at 4:44 a.m., the SBU announced, with a hint of triumph in their voices.